Madam President, distinguished delegates, it's a privilege to participate in this historic debate, and I deliver this statement in my own capacity as Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, and on behalf of the Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent. This statement is also joined by the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Freedom of Assembly and Association and the Coordination Committee of the UN Human Rights Special Procedures. The world is witnessing the largest ever transnational mobilization against systemic racism in law enforcement, sparked by the chilling images of the police killing of George Floyd. On May 25th, Derek Chauvin, a police officer in Minnesota, knelt on Mr. Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. While Mr. Floyd called out for help, 2 other officers helped hold him down, and another prevented bystanders from intervening. Among our jobs as independent experts appointed by the Human Rights Council is to sound the alarm in the face of grave human rights violations, and the situation in the United States has prompted us to do so. We refer you to the statement led by my mandate and joined by 47 special procedures mandate holders, which calls attention to the ongoing national uprising in the United States against systemic racism in law enforcement. We refer you to the statement led by the Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent and joined by other special procedures mandates that condemns what amounts to modern-day racial terror lynchings in the United States. We also refer you to recent special procedure statements led by the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Freedom of Peaceful Assembly and Association and by the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Opinion and Expression, condemning militarization of the police and the violent crackdown against peaceful protesters and journalists in the United States. The Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination has issued a statement under its early warning and urgent action procedures, raising alarm at the situation in the United States. Our collective analysis is that in the United States, the problem is not limited to specific enforcement practices or individual officers. It extends to the laws and the policies governing law enforcement. For people of African descent in the United States, the domestic system has utterly failed to acknowledge and confront racial injustice and discrimination. This injustice and discrimination is so deeply entrenched in law enforcement that even during this period of uprising, reports continue of extrajudicial killings of Black people by the police. This injustice and discrimination also affects other racial and ethnic minorities. And despite several decades of policing reform, executive intervention, and judicial oversight, this violence and racial injustice persists. Only a few days ago, Rayshard Brooks was shot and killed by police in Atlanta after he fell asleep in his car in the parking lot of a fast food restaurant. An important purpose of the UN human rights system and its international mechanisms is to ensure that where national authorities are unable or unwilling to protect human rights, those subject to violations have some means of recourse. The situation in the United States requires an international response that can help ensure that people of African descent in that country are no longer subject to routine but egregious violations that prompted this urgent debate in the first place. It's for this reason that any resolution adopted by the Human Rights Council at the conclusion of this debate must provide for an international commission of inquiry with the necessary authority to investigate systemic racism in law enforcement in the United States. Failure to do so would be to deny people of African descent in the United States the opportunity to draw on the global human rights system to challenge entrenched racial injustice. Failure to establish an international commission of inquiry would signal that Black lives do not matter, or that if they do, they don't matter enough to mobilize the Human Rights Council to intervene where it should. Equally important, the widespread and transnational nature of the protests we are seeing speak to the fact that systemic racism in law enforcement is also of urgent global concern. The massive transnational public outcry, including mobilization of people of all over the world, reflects their parallel, if not identical, local concerns with systemic racism in law enforcement. In our work, we found a common transnational thread in countries where racial injustice in law enforcement is most rampant, relating to failures to undo structures of racism originating in colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade. Systemic racism in law enforcement requires thematic engagement by the Council. For this reason, we strongly urge you to create a thematic commission of inquiry or other mechanism empowered to investigate systemic racism in law enforcement globally, especially where it is related to legacies of colonialism and transatlantic slavery. We believe the situation in the United States warrants urgent country-specific intervention and that a thematic global investigation is also in order. One cannot substitute for the other. We also wish to caution against a course of action that would rely on existing special procedures mandates to conduct an investigation into the issues that have led you to convene this debate. Both my mandate as Special Rapporteur and that of the working group are global, and you have tasked us with maintaining focus on the broad range of issues that arise under the umbrella of racial discrimination and intolerance. The issues before you today, systemic racism and law enforcement in the United States and in other parts of the world, cannot properly and fully be addressed if they are added to the long list of pressing responsibilities you've already assigned us. What's required today is the creation of commissions of inquiry or related mechanisms with the requisite resources to actually make a difference in the lives of the millions of people in the United States and around the world who are subject to systemic racism and law enforcement. Although our remarks have focused on systemic racism and law enforcement, we wish to highlight that the uprising in the United States and in other parts of the world are rejection of all systemic racism in all areas of life. As a result, this urgent debate is an important opportunity for members of the Council, the Secretary General, the High Commissioner on Human Rights, to recommit to supporting the different mechanisms and processes within the United Nations that have been established for the purposes of challenging systemic racism. The truth is, there's been a steady erosion within the United Nations of commitment to the anti-racism human rights framework, including to the historic commitments to combat structural forms of discrimination and intolerance that were made at the World Conference Against Racism in Durban in 2001. We need to see concrete changes on this front. We would like to conclude where we began. What is at stake here is the lives and lived experiences of human beings who deserve fundamental human rights protections and who should not be denied these rights on the basis of the color of their skin. Due to the time difference, I'm recording the statement on June 16, 2020. On June 16, 1976, thousands of Black students in South Africa took to the streets to protest apartheid in what we now call the Soweto Uprising. Many of you are likely familiar with the image of Hector Peterson, one of the children shot and killed by apartheid police during those protests. What does it mean that almost 50 years later, in the United States, people have to take to the streets to demand justice for Breonna Taylor? Breonna Taylor is the 26-year-old Black woman who was shot and killed by police in her own home in Louisville, Kentucky, in March this year. Using a no-knock warrant, police entered her home and shot her to death. The officers involved have not been charged with any crimes, nor have they been dismissed from employment. They're on administrative leave. The family members of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Philando Castile, and Michael Brown have turned to this body for help. They've joined others in calling for an international commission of inquiry for the situation in the United States. We are aware that some member states have argued that a commission of inquiry should be reserved for more serious human rights violations. We disagree. I repeat, we disagree. If the national and global uprisings we are witnessing are not sufficient evidence of the gravity of the issues before you, it's difficult to imagine what it would take to convince you that the situation we are facing is very serious. It's difficult to imagine what might convince you to demonstrate the equal worth of people of African descent. The decisions this Council will take in the context of this urgent debate will undoubtedly find their way into the history books, and we urge you to ensure that those decisions place this body on the right side of history. I thank you for your attention.